Nathan Carter, a high school teacher, discovers blood on his walls and a mysterious torn fabric with a strange symbol, plunging him into a dangerous conspiracy. With the help of investigative journalist Maggie Blake and his loyal dog Cooper, Nathan uncovers Victor Hastings, a corrupt real estate tycoon who has been exploiting the town for years. Framed for murder and hunted by Hastings' men, Nathan and Maggie risk everything to expose the truth, gathering incriminating evidence from a storage unit. After a tense confrontation, they escape with the proof, leading to Hastings' arrest and the collapse of his criminal network. But as Nathan begins to rebuild his life, a cryptic note warns him that the battle is far from over. What did you think of Nathan and Cooper's fight for justice? Are you watching from the US or somewhere else? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to DG Story for more thrilling tales like this one. Nathan Carter parked his car in the driveway, exhausted after another long day at the high school where he taught history. The night was unusually quiet, with only the faint rustling of the wind through the trees to break the silence. He glanced at his modest home, its warm porch light glowing faintly in the cool evening air. Another day done, Nathan muttered to himself, grabbing his bag and stepping out of the car. Cooper, his loyal Labrador, greeted him at the door with an enthusiastic wag of his tail. "Hey, boy," Nathan said, kneeling to scratch behind Cooper's ears. "You keeping the place safe?" But Cooper didn't respond the way he usually did. His tail stopped wagging, and his ears perked up. He sniffed the air, then let out a low growl, staring at the front door. Nathan froze. "What's wrong, buddy?" The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. He always locked the door before leaving for work. Yet now, the door was slightly ajar, the latch undone. His heart pounded as he pushed the door open cautiously, his hand gripping the strap of his bag like a makeshift weapon. Inside, the house was still, too still. The faint glow of the kitchen light spilled into the living room, where Nathan stopped dead in his tracks. Blood, smears of deep crimson streaked the pale beige walls, stark and jarring against the otherwise neat room. The metallic scent hit him next, faint but undeniable. "Cooper," Nathan whispered, his voice trembling. The dog stayed close, his body tense and his nose low to the ground. Nathan scanned the room, his eyes darting to every corner. Nothing was out of place, no broken furniture, no shattered windows. Yet the blood told a different story. His gaze landed on the floor near the coffee table, where something small and dark lay crumpled. He inched closer, heart hammering, and picked it up. It was a piece of fabric, torn and coarse, with an intricate symbol embroidered in faded red thread. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, turning the fabric over in his hand. Cooper let out another growl, his attention fixed on the hallway leading to the bedrooms. Nathan's stomach churned. Was someone still in the house? Fighting the urge to panic, Nathan pulled out his phone. He started to dial the police but stopped. What if this was a mistake? What if there was a reasonable explanation? The thought of officers swarming his home, questioning him about blood on the walls, made him hesitate. Instead, he decided to check the rest of the house himself. "Stay close, Cooper," he whispered, gripping a flashlight from the shelf near the door. Room by room, he searched. The guest bedroom was untouched, his bed neatly made. The bathroom was spotless. But as he approached his own bedroom, a chill ran down his spine. The door was slightly ajar, just like the front door. Cooper's growls deepened, and he pressed himself against Nathan's leg, his body taut with tension. "Easy, boy," Nathan said, pushing the door open slowly. The room was empty. Nothing seemed out of place, no overturned furniture, no sign of a struggle. Yet the air felt heavy, as if the room itself held its breath. Nathan sighed in relief but couldn't shake the unease that gripped him. He returned to the living room, staring at the blood-streaked walls and the mysterious piece of fabric in his hand. Someone had been here. Someone had left this behind. But why? Cooper barked sharply, startling Nathan. The dog's eyes were locked on the front door, his growls starting up again. Nathan moved to the door and looked outside. The porch light cast long shadows across the yard, but everything seemed still, too still. As he stood there, gripping the fabric tightly, a thought struck him. He couldn't handle this alone. That's when he remembered Maggie Blake. Nathan sat at his kitchen table, the torn piece of fabric spread out before him. Cooper lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes remained alert, watching the hallway. Nathan couldn't stop turning the fabric over in his hands, tracing the strange symbol stitched in red. Whoever had been in his house wasn't a random intruder. This wasn't just a burglary. There was intent behind this, but he couldn't make sense of it. A sharp knock at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. Cooper jumped to his feet, barking loudly. Nathan stood quickly, his heart racing. He hesitated for a moment, then cautiously approached the door. "Who is it?" he called, his voice firm despite his unease. "It's Maggie Blake," a woman's voice replied. "Nathan, I heard about what happened. Let me in." Nathan unlocked the door and opened it, revealing Maggie standing on his porch. She was in her early 30s, with sharp green eyes that always seemed to be assessing everything around her. A local journalist known for digging into the town's deepest secrets, Maggie had a reputation for uncovering the truth no matter the cost. "You've got 5 minutes," Nathan said, stepping aside to let her in. Maggie wasted no time. "I ran into Ben, the officer you called off duty at the diner. He said you mentioned finding something strange at home." Her eyes swept over the room, landing on the blood-streaked wall. "I didn't realize it was this serious." Nathan folded his arms. "I'm not exactly looking for publicity, Maggie. I'm not here to make a headline," Maggie said, her tone serious. "I think this might be connected to something bigger." Nathan hesitated, then gestured to the piece of fabric on the table. "You ever seen anything like this?" Maggie picked it up, examining the symbol closely. Her expression darkened. "Yeah," she said slowly. "It's been a while, but I've seen this before. It showed up in some records tied to Hastings development." "Hastings development? You mean Victor Hastings?" She nodded. "The guy practically owns this town. Most people think he's just a real estate mogul, but there are whispers about what really goes on behind closed doors. Fraud, coercion, you name it. This," she held up the fabric, "might be a piece of the puzzle." Nathan frowned. "Why would someone from Hastings Development break into my house?" "That's the question, isn't it?" Maggie said. "But we're not going to find the answer sitting around here." Cooper let out a low growl, his nose pointing toward the backyard. Nathan grabbed a flashlight, and Maggie followed him to the back door. The yard stretched into a dense patch of woods, the trees casting long, jagged shadows under the pale light of the moon. "Cooper seems to think there's something out there," Maggie said, her voice quiet. Nathan clicked on the flashlight and swept the beam over the yard. "Let's see if he's right." Cooper led the way, sniffing the ground as he moved. His tail was stiff, his ears perked, and his steps deliberate. Nathan and Maggie followed closely, their breaths visible in the cool night air. The trail led them into the woods, where the air grew colder and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. Nathan's flashlight caught glimpses of broken twigs and faint impressions in the dirt. Footprints. He realized, "Someone's been through here," Maggie whispered. They followed the trail until Cooper stopped abruptly, growling at something in the underbrush. Nathan moved the flashlight, and the beam landed on a small, bloodied knife lying partially buried in the dirt. Maggie crouched down, careful not to touch it. "This just keeps getting better," she muttered. "It's not a kitchen knife. Looks more like something you'd see in a hunting kit." Nathan's stomach churned as he took in the sight of the blade. Why would they leave this behind? "Maybe they didn't mean to," Maggie said, standing. "Or maybe they wanted someone to find it. Either way, this is starting to look like more than just a break-in." The sound of a branch snapping nearby made both of them freeze, Nathan turned the flashlight toward the sound, but the woods were empty. "Let's get out of here," Maggie said. "We've got enough for now." As they retraced their steps back to the house, Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every whisper of wind felt like a threat. When they reached the yard, Maggie turned to him. "I'll look into the symbol on this fabric and see what I can dig up. But Nathan, you need to be careful. If this really is connected to Hastings, you're in way deeper than you think." Nathan nodded, gripping the torn fabric tightly. "Just tell me what you find." Maggie hesitated. "And Nathan, maybe think about calling the police. You can't do this alone." After she left, Nathan locked every door and window in the house, his nerves on edge. He looked down at Cooper, who sat by his side, alert as ever. "We're in this together." "Boy," Nathan said, his voice low, "whatever this is, we'll figure it out." But as he stood there, staring out into the dark woods, he couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. Nathan's nerves were frayed. It had been a restless night, filled with fleeting shadows and imagined sounds from the woods outside his home. By the time the first rays of sunlight filtered through the blinds, he was up, pacing the kitchen. Maggie hadn't called yet, and the silence gnawed at him. He poured himself a cup of coffee, his hand trembling slightly as he brought it to his lips. Cooper sat by the door, his ears perked and his tail wagging faintly every time Nathan moved. "I know, boy," Nathan muttered. "You don't trust this either." Before he could settle down, a sharp knock on the door startled him. Cooper barked, rushing to the entryway. Nathan hesitated, then looked through the peephole. 2 officers stood on the porch, their expressions stern. Nathan opened the door cautiously. "Can I help you, Mr. Carter?" one of the officers asked. "I'm Officer Peterson, and this is Officer Daniels. We need to ask you a few questions." Nathan's chest tightened. "What's this about?" Peterson held up a small evidence bag containing the bloody knife Nathan and Maggie had found in the woods the night before. "Mind explaining why this was found near your property?" Nathan stared at the knife, his mind racing. I didn't put it there," he stammered. "I found it last night while I was out walking with my dog." "Convenient," Daniels said, his tone skeptical. "And you didn't think to report it to us?" Nathan bristled. "I didn't know what it was. I was going to call." "But you were going to call?" Daniels cut him off. "Or were you going to make sure there wasn't more evidence pointing to you?" "What are you talking about?" Nathan demanded. "I have nothing to do with this." Peterson exchanged a glance with his partner. "We're going to need you to come down to the station, Mr. Carter." Nathan's stomach sank. "Am I under arrest?" "Not yet," Peterson said. "But if you don't cooperate, things could get worse." Nathan hesitated, then nodded. "Let me grab my keys." As he turned back into the house, his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was Maggie. He snatched it up and answered in a hushed tone. "Maggie, I'm in trouble. The police are here. They found the knife." "What?" Maggie's voice was sharp. "Nathan, don't say anything without a lawyer. I'm on my way." Before he could respond, Peterson called out from the door, "Mr. Carter, let's go." At the station, Nathan was led into a small, sterile room with a single table and 2 chairs. Peterson sat across from him, a file in hand, while Daniels stood by the door, arms crossed. "You want to explain why your fingerprints were found on the knife?" Peterson asked, opening the file. Nathan blinked. "What? That's impossible. I never touched it." Peterson slid a photo across the table. It showed the knife, but something was off. The handle was smeared with what looked like partial prints. Nathan's prints. "That's a lie," Nathan said, his voice shaking. "I didn't touch that knife." Daniels stepped forward. "Maybe you forgot, or maybe you're trying to cover something up. We've got a missing person, Mr. Carter, a man named Daniel Ross, and your property is looking like a crime scene." Nathan's pulse quickened. "I don't even know who Daniel Ross is." Peterson leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Funny, because Ross was last seen near your neighborhood 2 nights ago, and now we find his blood on a knife near your backyard. Nathan's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. Someone's setting me up, he said. You have to believe me. Before Peterson could respond, the door burst open. Maggie strode in, her expression fierce. Nathan, she said firmly, don't say another word. She turned to the officers, her tone icy. If you want to continue this interrogation, my client needs legal representation. Client? Peterson asked, raising an eyebrow. That's right, Maggie said. And if you think you can pin this on him without solid evidence, you've got another thing coming. Peterson and Daniels exchanged glances, then rose from their seats. We're not done here, Peterson said, gathering the file. Maggie waited until they were gone before sitting down across from Nathan. Are you okay? Nathan let out a shaky breath. They think I killed someone. Maggie, what am I supposed to do? Maggie leaned in, her voice low. You're not alone in this. I've been digging into that symbol from the fabric. It's definitely tied to Victor Hastings. And Daniel Ross? He was a whistleblower. He tried to expose Hastings for fraud a few years ago, but disappeared before he could go public. Nathan frowned. So you think Hastings is behind this? Maggie nodded. And I think they planted that knife to make you look guilty. Nathan's jaw tightened. Then we have to prove it. Maggie hesitated. There's one person who might be able to help, Eleanor King. She used to work with Ross and might know what he was planning before he disappeared. But she's not exactly trustworthy. What choice do we have? Nathan asked. Maggie sighed. None. Apparently. That night, Nathan and Maggie met Eleanor in a dimly lit bar on the edge of town. She was a striking woman in her early 40s, with sharp features and an air of guarded confidence. I don't know why you're dragging me into this, Eleanor said, swirling her drink. Ross is dead, and poking around Hastings' business is a death sentence. We're not asking you to poke around, Maggie said. We just need information. What was Ross working on before he disappeared? Eleanor hesitated, her eyes darting around the room. He found something big, documents linking Hastings to a series of illegal land grabs. He was going to take it to the FBI, but he didn't get the chance. Why not? Nathan asked. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. Because Hastings found out. And if you're smart, you'll drop this before you end up like Ross. Nathan leaned forward. I can't drop this. He's framing me. Eleanor, I need those documents. Eleanor stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. Fine, I'll see what I can dig up. But don't expect miracles. As she left the bar, Maggie watched her go, suspicion flickering in her eyes. Do you trust her? Nathan asked. Not even a little, Maggie said. Nathan couldn't shake the uneasy feeling as he and Maggie drove back from the meeting with Eleanor. The dim glow of the car's dashboard illuminated Maggie's pensive expression. You don't believe a word she said, do you? Nathan finally asked. Maggie shook her head. Eleanor's not exactly trustworthy, but if there's even a chance she's telling the truth, we have to follow it. Cooper, sitting in the back seat, let out a soft whine. Nathan glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his heart sinking. Even his loyal companion seemed uneasy, as if sensing the danger that loomed ahead. By the time they reached Nathan's house, the night was thick with tension. The porch light flickered ominously as they stepped inside. Maggie pulled out her laptop and began researching everything she could about Victor Hastings and the alleged land grabs Eleanor had mentioned. I don't like this, Nathan muttered, pacing the room. We're putting our trust in someone who could easily be working for Hastings. Maggie didn't look up. You think I don't know that? But we don't have any other leads. Nathan stopped pacing, his gaze falling on the torn fabric still sitting on the table. What about this? The symbol? It has to mean something. Maggie finally looked up, her eyes narrowing. You're right. Symbols like that are often tied to specific groups or organizations. If we can figure out who uses it, We might find a link to Hastings' network. Before Nathan could respond, Cooper let out a sharp bark. Both of them froze, their eyes darting toward the back door. "What is it, boy?" Nathan asked, moving cautiously toward the kitchen. Cooper growled, his body tense. As he sniffed at the door, Nathan reached for the light switch, but Maggie grabbed his arm. "Don't," she whispered. "If someone's out there, we don't want them to know we're here." Nathan nodded, and together they peered through the small window beside the door. The backyard was shrouded in darkness, but the faint outline of a figure moved near the tree line. "Stay here," Nathan said, grabbing a flashlight. Maggie grabbed his arm again. "Are you insane? We don't know who or what that is." "I can't just stand here and do nothing," Nathan said. "Cooper's got my back." Reluctantly, Maggie followed him as he stepped out onto the porch, the flashlight cutting through the darkness. Cooper stayed close, his nose to the ground, his growls low and steady. The figure was gone by the time they reached the trees, but Cooper led them deeper into the woods, his body language tense and focused. "What do you think he's tracking?" Maggie whispered. Nathan shook his head. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's close." After a few minutes, Cooper stopped abruptly, sniffing furiously at the ground. Nathan shone the flashlight down and froze. A faint trail of blood led to a small, decrepit shed hidden among the trees. "That's not creepy at all," Maggie muttered. Nathan ignored her and moved toward the shed, his pulse pounding. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. He pushed it open, and the beam of the flashlight revealed a scene that made his stomach churn. Inside the shed were stacks of folders and papers scattered across a rickety table. In the center of the room lay a tattered jacket with the same symbol embroidered on its sleeve. Bloodstains marred the fabric. Maggie stepped inside, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. This is a gold mine." Nathan picked up one of the folders, flipping through its contents. Maps, contracts, and handwritten notes detailed Hastings Development's acquisition of various properties, some of which had clearly been obtained through illegal means. "This is it," Maggie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is the proof we need." Before Nathan could respond, Cooper growled again, his body low and his ears pinned back. "Someone's coming," Maggie hissed. They extinguished the flashlight and crouched low as the sound of footsteps grew louder outside the shed. Through the cracks in the wooden walls, Nathan could see the glow of flashlights bobbing in the distance. "Check the perimeter," a gruff voice said. Maggie's breath hitched. "Hastings' men," she whispered. Nathan motioned for her to stay quiet as he clutched the folder tightly. Cooper remained still, his growls low but controlled. The footsteps drew closer, the beams of light sweeping over the shed. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest as he weighed their options. They couldn't stay hidden for long, but making a run for it seemed just as dangerous. One of the men stopped outside the shed, his flashlight shining directly on the door. "Looks like someone's been here," he said. Nathan braced himself, ready to defend Maggie and Cooper if it came to that. But before the man could step inside, another voice called out, "Leave it for now. We've got bigger problems." The men retreated, their flashlights disappearing into the woods. Nathan waited until the sound of their footsteps faded completely before exhaling in relief. "That was too close," Maggie said, her voice shaking. Nathan nodded. "We need to get out of here, now." They gathered as many documents as they could carry and slipped out of the shed, moving as quietly as possible through the woods. Cooper led the way, his instincts guiding them back to the safety of the house. By the time they locked the door behind them, both Nathan and Maggie were visibly shaken. "What now?" Nathan asked, dropping the folders on the table. "Now," Maggie said, flipping through the documents. "We figure out how to use this to bring Hastings down, and we do it before his men realize what we've taken." As Nathan looked at the pile of evidence, he felt a flicker of hope. For the first time, they had something concrete, something that could expose Hastings for who he truly was. But deep down, he knew the fight was far from over. Nathan barely slept that night. Every creak of the house, every faint rustle outside sent a jolt of adrenaline through his body. Cooper stayed close, pacing the room with restless energy. Across the kitchen table, Maggie sifted through the stolen documents, her eyes scanning each page with laser focus. "This is bigger than I thought," she muttered, pushing a sheet toward Nathan. "Look at this." Nathan leaned over to examine the page. It was a handwritten note, scrawled in hurried, messy letters. "The deals are in place. Hastings knows we're close. If anything happens to me, the files are in storage unit 46. "That's Daniel Ross's handwriting," Maggie said. "It has to be." Nathan frowned. "Storage unit 46. Do we know where that is?" Maggie nodded. "There's a storage facility on the edge of town. If the files are there, they might have everything we need to bury Hastings for good." Nathan hesitated. "And what happens when Hastings realizes we have this?" Maggie met his gaze, her expression grim. "He already knows. That's why his men were in the woods last night." A loud knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Nathan jumped to his feet, grabbing a baseball bat from behind the door. Cooper barked furiously, his tail stiff as he positioned himself in front of Maggie. "Stay here," Nathan whispered, edging toward the door. He peered through the peephole and exhaled in relief. "It's Eleanor." Nathan opened the door cautiously, but his relief quickly turned to suspicion when he saw Eleanor's pale, shaken expression. "They're onto you," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Hastings knows you have the documents. He's sending more men to clean this up." Maggie narrowed her eyes. "How do you know that?" Eleanor hesitated, her gaze darting between them. I overheard a call. He's desperate to shut this down before it goes public." "You're working for him, aren't you?" Maggie demanded, her voice sharp. "No," Eleanor snapped. "I left Hastings years ago. I'm trying to help you." Nathan stepped between them, his voice calm but firm. "If that's true, then prove it. Tell us everything you know." Eleanor hesitated again, then sighed. "Hastings has men watching the storage facility. They know that's where Ross kept the files. If you're planning to go there, you need to be ready for a fight." Maggie studied Eleanor for a long moment, then nodded. "Fine, but if you're lying to us." "I swear, I'm not lying," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "But you need to move fast." Later that night, Nathan, Maggie, and Eleanor drove to the storage facility. The air was thick with tension as they parked a few blocks away and approached on foot. Cooper trotted silently beside Nathan, his body low and alert. The facility was surrounded by a chain-link fence, its rows of storage units bathed in the cold glow of security lights. From their hiding spot in the shadows, Nathan could see two men standing guard near one of the units. "That has to be it," Maggie whispered. Nathan tightened his grip on the flashlight in his hand. "How do we get past them?" Eleanor pointed to the far end of the fence. "There's a gap over there. If we're quiet, we can get around them." They moved cautiously, staying low as they slipped through the gap in the fence. Cooper led the way, his nose to the ground, guiding them toward the unit marked 46. When they reached the unit, Maggie pulled out the key they'd found in the woods. She slid it into the lock and twisted, holding her breath as the door creaked open. Inside, the air was stale and heavy with the scent of dust and mildew. Stacks of boxes lined the walls, and in the center of the room was a metal filing cabinet. "This has to be it," Maggie said, hurrying to the cabinet. Nathan stayed near the door, his ears straining for any sign of movement outside. Cooper stood beside him, his growls low and constant. Maggie pulled open the cabinet drawers, her hands trembling as she rifled through the files. "These are it," she whispered. "Contracts, bank statements, signed orders. This is everything we need." Before Nathan could respond, a sharp whistle echoed outside. "They're here," Eleanor hissed. Nathan grabbed the cabinet drawer and yanked it out entirely, spilling the files onto the floor. "Take what you can carry," he said, Maggie stuffed as many documents as she could into her bag, while Nathan and Eleanor did the same. Suddenly, the door burst open, and two men stormed in, their flashlights blinding. "Stop right there," one of them shouted, raising a gun. Cooper lunged before anyone could react, his jaws locking onto the man's arm. The gun clattered to the floor as the man screamed in pain. Nathan didn't hesitate. He grabbed the flashlight and swung it hard, knocking the second man to the ground. Maggie and Eleanor darted past them, clutching the stolen files. "Come on," Maggie yelled. Nathan called for Cooper, who released the man's arm and bolted after them. They ran through the storage facility, the sound of shouting and footsteps close behind. At the fence, Maggie tossed her bag over before climbing through the gap. Nathan pushed Eleanor ahead of him, then turned back to see Cooper hesitating. "Cooper, come on," Nathan yelled. The dog bounded toward him just as another man appeared. A gun raised, Nathan ducked, dragging Cooper through the gap as a shot rang out. They didn't stop running until they reached the car. Maggie floored the gas pedal, the engine roaring as they sped away. In the rearview mirror, Nathan could see the storage facility fading into the distance. His chest heaved as he clutched Cooper tightly, the adrenaline coursing through him. "That was too close," Maggie said, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Nathan nodded, his grip on Cooper loosening as relief washed over him. "But we got what we came for." Maggie glanced at the bag of documents in the back seat. "Let's just hope it's enough to end this." The safe house was a small, run-down cabin deep in the woods, far from the prying eyes of Hastings' men. Nathan, Maggie, Eleanor, and Cooper sat around the wooden table, the piles of documents they had stolen spread out before them. Maggie flipped through the files with focused intensity. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Proof of everything. Fraud, illegal land acquisitions, bribes. Hastings has been controlling this town for years." Nathan leaned over her shoulder, scanning a list of names attached to bank transfers. "These are local officials, judges, council members, even the chief of police." Eleanor crossed her arms, her face pale. "This is dangerous. Maggie, Hastings won't go down without a fight. He'll come after all of us." Maggie glanced up, her green eyes hard. "Let him. The truth is more important than our fear." Eleanor scoffed. "That's easy for you to say. You're not the one with a target on your back." Nathan stepped in. "She's right, Eleanor. Hastings already knows we're a threat. The only way to stop him is to make this public." Eleanor hesitated, then sighed. "Fine, but if this goes sideways, don't say I didn't warn you." Cooper, lying at Nathan's feet, let out a low growl, drawing everyone's attention. His ears perked up, and his gaze fixed on the window. "What is it, boy?" Nathan asked, standing, before anyone could react. The sound of car engines roared in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Maggie bolted to the window and peeked through the curtain. "They've found us," she said, her voice tight. Nathan's stomach dropped. "How?" Eleanor's face hardened. "It doesn't matter how. What matters is what we do now." Maggie grabbed the stack of documents and stuffed them into her bag. "We can't let them get their hands on this. Nathan, take Cooper and go out the back. I'll hold them off." "No way," Nathan said firmly. "I'm not leaving you behind." "We don't have time to argue," Maggie snapped. "We need to split up. If they catch all of us, Hastings wins." Nathan clenched his jaw but nodded. "Fine, but you'd better make it out of this." Maggie flashed him a quick smile. "You too." Nathan and Cooper slipped out the back door, the cold night air biting at their faces as they sprinted into the woods. Behind them, the sound of shouting and car doors slamming filled the air. Cooper stayed close, his nose to the ground, guiding Nathan through the dense forest. The beams of flashlights danced through the trees, growing closer with each passing second. Nathan's heart pounded as he pushed forward, his legs burning with every step. He could hear the men behind him, their voices barking orders to spread out and search the area. "Come on, boy," Nathan whispered, urging Cooper to move faster. The forest opened up into a small clearing, and Nathan spotted an old hunting shack tucked against the treeline. He darted inside, pulling Cooper with him and shutting the door as quietly as he could. Inside, the shack was dark and musty, with broken furniture and rusted tools scattered across the floor. Nathan crouched in the corner, his hand gripping Cooper's collar to keep him still. The sound of footsteps approached, crunching on the dry leaves outside. Nathan held his breath, his heart hammering in his chest as shadows passed by the small window. One of the men stopped near the shack, his flashlight sweeping over the door. "I think I heard something in here," the man said. Nathan's grip tightened on Cooper, silently willing the dog to stay quiet. Before the man could open the door, a loud crash echoed through the forest, followed by Maggie's voice shouting, "Over here!" The man cursed and ran toward the noise, his footsteps fading into the distance. Nathan exhaled shakily, his hand trembling as he patted Cooper's head. "She's buying us time," he whispered. Nathan waited until the forest fell silent, then slipped out of the shack, moving cautiously through the trees. He knew he couldn't stop. Hastings' men wouldn't give up that easily. Back at the cabin, Maggie faced off against two of Hastings' enforcers. She ducked behind an overturned table as bullets ripped through the air, splintering wood and shattering glass. "You can't run forever," one of the men shouted. Maggie clenched her jaw, her mind racing as she scanned the room. She spotted a heavy cast iron pan lying on the floor nearby and grabbed it, using it as a makeshift shield as she bolted toward the door. The men followed, their footsteps pounding behind her as she sprinted into the woods. Maggie knew she couldn't outrun them, but she didn't need to. She just needed to lead them away from Nathan and Cooper. She reached a steep ravine and stopped, catching her breath as the men closed in. "End of the line, sweetheart," one of them sneered, raising his gun. Maggie smirked, her chest heaving. "You think so?" Before they could react, she swung the pan with all her strength, knocking the gun out of the man's hand. She lunged at the second man, using the momentum to shove him off balance. Both men tumbled down the ravine, their shouts echoing as they disappeared into the darkness. Maggie stood at the edge, her hands trembling as she stared down. "Not bad," she muttered to herself, brushing dirt off her jacket. Hours later, Nathan and Maggie reunited at a diner on the outskirts of town. Eleanor was waiting for them, her face pale but relieved. "You made it," Nathan said, sinking into the booth beside her. "Barely," Maggie replied, sliding the bag of documents across the table. "But we've got everything we need." Eleanor opened the bag and flipped through the files, her expression growing grim. "This is enough to bury Hastings, but we need to move fast before he can cover his tracks." Maggie nodded. "I've already contacted a journalist from the Washington Post. He's willing to meet us and publish the story." Nathan exhaled, the weight of the past few days finally lifting. "Then let's finish this." As they made their plans, Cooper lay at Nathan's feet, his tail wagging faintly. For the first time in days, Nathan felt a glimmer of hope. But deep down, he knew the fight wasn't over. Hastings wouldn't go down without a fight, and the road ahead was still filled with danger. Nathan adjusted his jacket as he stepped out of the car, the early morning air biting against his skin. Maggie stood beside him, a determined look in her eyes as she clutched the bag of documents. Cooper trotted along faithfully, his tail wagging slightly despite the tension in the air. The meeting point was a secluded parking lot near the city limits. A black SUV sat parked under a flickering streetlight, and a man in his mid-40s stepped out as they approached. His sharp suit and calm demeanor exuded professionalism, but there was a wariness in his eyes as he extended a hand. "Evan Delgado," he introduced himself, "journalist with the Washington Post." "Maggie Blake," she replied, shaking his hand. "And this is Nathan Carter." Evan nodded at Nathan, then glanced down at Cooper. "I see you brought backup." "He's more reliable than most people," Nathan said, managing a small smile. Maggie handed Evan the bag. "Everything you need is in there. Signed contracts, financial records, emails. It's enough to expose Hastings and his entire network." Evan opened the bag and sifted through the files, his brows furrowing as he skimmed the contents. "This is damning," he said, his voice low. "But it also makes you a target. Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Nathan's jaw tightened. "We don't have a choice. Hastings framed me for murder. If we don't take him down, he'll destroy more lives." Evan nodded. "All right, I'll get this to my editor. We'll run the story in tomorrow's paper." "Tomorrow?" Maggie asked, her voice sharp. "You need to move faster. Hastings will retaliate the moment he knows what we're doing." "I'll do my best," Evan said, "but we have to do this right. If we rush, it gives him room to discredit us." Before Maggie could argue, Cooper let out a low growl, his ears flattening. Nathan turned, his stomach sinking as he spotted two black SUVs pulling into the parking lot. "They found us," he muttered. Evan's eyes widened. "Who?" "Hastings' men," Maggie said, her voice tense. "We need to go. Now." The parking lot erupted into chaos as Hastings' men spilled out of the SUVs, their weapons glinting under the streetlight. "Get down," Maggie shouted, pulling Evan behind the car. Nathan ducked behind a concrete barrier, his heart pounding as bullets ricocheted around them. Cooper stayed low, his body pressed against Nathan's side. "What do we do?" Evan shouted over the gunfire. "We fight back," Maggie said, pulling a tire iron from the trunk of her car. Nathan glanced at her, his jaw tightening. "Maggie, this isn't the time to. I'm not letting them take us without a fight," she snapped. Before Nathan could respond, Cooper bolted from his side, darting through the chaos with incredible speed. He lunged at one of Hastings' men, knocking him to the ground and disarming him. "Cooper!" Nathan yelled, scrambling to his feet. He rushed toward his dog, grabbing the fallen weapon and aiming it at another attacker. Maggie followed, swinging the tire iron and taking down another man with a well-placed blow. Evan stayed crouched behind the car, clutching the bag of documents as if his life depended on it. One of Hastings' men raised his gun, aiming it directly at Nathan. Before he could fire, Cooper lunged again, sinking his teeth into the man's arm. The gun clattered to the ground, and Nathan quickly subdued him. The remaining attackers hesitated, their eyes darting between Nathan, Maggie, and the furious Labrador standing protectively in front of them. "Fall back," one of them muttered, retreating toward the SUVs. Within moments, the parking lot was silent again, the attackers retreating into the night. Nathan collapsed against the concrete barrier, his chest heaving as he stroked Cooper's fur. "You saved my life, boy," he murmured. Cooper wagged his tail, his eyes bright despite the chaos. Maggie leaned against the car, her hands shaking as she wiped blood from a small cut on her forehead. "That was too close," she said, her voice trembling. Evan emerged from his hiding spot, clutching the bag of documents tightly. "If I wasn't convinced before, I am now," he said. "Hastings needs to be stopped." Nathan nodded. "Then let's finish this." The next morning, the story broke. The Washington Post published a scathing exposé detailing Hastings' crimes, complete with incriminating documents and interviews. The article went viral within hours, drawing national attention and sparking outrage across the country. By midday, Hastings was arrested at his sprawling mansion, his empire crumbling around him. Dozens of his associates, including the corrupt police chief and several town officials, were also taken into custody. Nathan watched the news from his living room, a sense of relief washing over him as he saw Hastings led away in handcuffs. Maggie sat beside him, her laptop open as she fielded calls from reporters and officials seeking more details. "You did it," Nathan said, his voice quiet. "We did it," Maggie corrected, offering him a small smile. Cooper lay at Nathan's feet, his tail wagging lazily as if he understood the gravity of the moment. In the weeks that followed, Nathan's life slowly began to return to normal. The charges against him were dropped, and his name was cleared. He returned to teaching, grateful for the chance to rebuild the life Hastings had nearly destroyed. Maggie continued her work as a journalist, her reputation soaring after the Hastings exposé. But despite her newfound fame, she remained close to Nathan. their bond forged through shared danger and determination. As for Cooper, he became a local hero. The town held a small ceremony in his honor, presenting him with a medal for bravery. Nathan couldn't have been prouder of his loyal companion. One evening, as Nathan and Cooper sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the quiet neighborhood, a black envelope was slipped under the door. Nathan picked it up, his brows furrowing as he opened it. Inside was a single note, written in the same hurried handwriting as the one they'd found before. "You've only scratched the surface. Be ready." Nathan's heart sank as he folded the note and looked out into the darkening street. "Looks like it's not over yet, boy," he said, glancing down at Cooper. Cooper let out a low growl, his eyes scanning the shadows. Nathan nodded, determination hardening in his gaze. "We'll be ready,"